the Africa CDC established the Partnerships for Africa Vaccine Manufacturing. And that's the Africa Union, established the Partnerships for Africa Vaccine Manufacturing. And the remit of this initiative is to deliver the bold goal of enabling Africa vaccine manufacturing industry to develop and produce and supply over 60% of our total vaccine doses required. And that is up from less than 1% today. So that is really bold. By 2040, we are hoping to be at 60%. That's the aspiration of the Africa Union. So the PAVM, Partnerships for Africa Vaccine Manufacturing, is quite, it's an initiative that is really rooted in advocacy for us as member states to realize that. Additionally, there have been several civil society organizations and other advocates' efforts, including this one, this learning collaborative that is today pulling together all our perspectives on the need to advocate for local vaccine manufacturing, understanding what it takes to fund, what are the policy aspects, is there an ideal market environment so that we can realize our aspiration as a continent. And even as I speak about realizing our aspiration as a continent, I want to just share with you a little bit of what I would call a landscape. And as I begin to share that, I will just mention again that we are here courtesy of the Coalition to Accelerate and Support Prevention Research, CASPA, which is funded through AVAC, the organization which John mentioned that he works for. And we are a coalition of several partners. You can just see a few logos out of the 13 logos, I think, on the screen. So looking at the landscape, the vaccine manufacturing landscape, in terms of the conversations and the focus, a lot of the focus is on pandemic preparedness. And this, needless to say, is because of where we have been with the COVID pandemic and the experience that we had with vaccine apartheid. So there have been various commitments. I mentioned the one of the Africa Union to have 60% local manufacturing of our routine and also the novel vaccines by 2040. There have been several initiatives towards making this a reality. An MOU between CEPI and the African Union to develop the expertise. We have also seen a pandemic preparedness fund set up to have research and projects towards making this vaccine manufacturing a reality. We have seen the conversations about having hubs locally on the continent. For example, the hub and spoke initiative funded and supported by the WHO. So, but where are we right now? When we look at where we are in terms of capacity, after having had all these conversations, having had all these commitments, this is where we are right now. There are about five countries that have end-to-end manufacturing capability. That means they can put together the components, they can package them, they can produce them for marketing, for sale. We have several countries that have fill and finish, or the ability to import vaccines. So sometimes when we are speaking about having vaccine manufacturing capacities, if you look at the countries that are mentioned as having the capacity, For example, Morocco, Nigeria, Ethiopia, what we have is fill and finish capacity. So using the basic products from another country, what has already been constituted for us, and then adequately filling and finishing and marketing these products. But how about the capacity on the continent to develop those biologics, to introduce them to the market, to go through all the regulatory processes of developing, regulating, and producing vaccines on the continent. The key conversations really around our landscape for vaccine R&D, vaccine manufacturing research is on the aspect of having self-reliance. And that came up a lot in our first question: why should we be advocating for vaccine development? We are looking at an issue where we are anticipating, we've actually been asked to anticipate more pandemics as we look at climate change and the increasing interaction between human and livestock, and the different zoonotic diseases that are either emerging as new ones or re-emerging as being triggered by that, the changes that we are having in our environment. There has been a call to action by the African Union, which we're calling the Africa New Public Health Order. And key among this is expanding the local manufacture of health products. And that's again for the reasons that you mentioned: self-reliance, rapid access, and having, locally, contextually relevant products when we need them and at a price that we can afford to have them. Some of the conversations that have been there in terms of advocacy and advocacy opportunities have been the US Africa Leaders Summit, the various summits that we have with the annual summits that we have with our leaders, the Africa Union summits, the Conference for Public Health in Africa, and incidentally, this year's edition of Conference for Public Health in Africa happens in November in Lusaka. The Agenda for Health, the Africa Health Agenda International Conference, AHIC, which happened in March. It happens every 2 years. There are other conversations that are necessary to have when we're looking at vaccine manufacturing, including the regulation of both the development process, the clinical trials aspect, and also the regulation of products if and when they are available. And so these are the conversations really that are around which the vaccine manufacturing conversations are playing. So that, in a nutshell, is a summary of where we are in terms of a landscape. And I'm going to hand it back over to you, John, I think, so that we can dig a little bit deeper into this and just look at which conversations have we been a part of, which initiatives are we aware of, and what do we feel is really lacking in all these conversations towards making vaccine manufacturing, local vaccine manufacturing in Africa a reality. Over to you, John.
There's a request. Yeah, thank you so much, Eva. There's a request to put the last slide on again. The one with all the upcoming conferences and meetings.
Oh, this is really a slide of the conferences where the conversations, these are notable forums where the conversations either have happened or the upcoming. So the annual AU Summit, that's something that happens every year. And so in 2023, the sustainable financing was a topic of conversation, but that is also an opportunity in the coming year, in the lead up to the AU Summit, in preparation for that. That's an opportunity for advocacy, for us to have conversations around either the policy and the markets, also the markets aspect, because some of them, the initiatives that have already happened, the reports, the research, the analysis of what our situation is currently, have shown that there are two key issues that have the potential to be either a barrier or an enabler for local vaccine manufacturing. One of it is sustainable financing for product development. And we realize that we are speaking about vaccine development for our market, for our continent, and in disease areas that are of importance to us. We have Marburg, we have Lassa fever, we have a disproportionate burden of HIV and TB as a continent, as a subcontinent. And then there's also the aspect of consolidating the markets and making it worthwhile. Vaccine manufacturing is a heavy financial investment. So how can we ensure that that investment is worthwhile? We have the necessary market, consolidation of market, and the plan to have these vaccines, if and when we develop them, then purchased by us. Are we going to purchase from ourselves? Are we going to have our African countries producing the vaccines, and then we still purchase them from elsewhere? And then lastly, there's also a critical aspect of the regulatory aspect, and not so much because well, let me put it this way, because these are new areas that we are looking at, so there's the need to increase the capacity for regulatory processes, both in the product development aspect and also in the product introduction market aspect. Over.
Yes, thank you so much, Ethel, for that landscape and all of that information. I do see Robert has his hand up. Feel free to come off mute and provide your comment or question.
Hello, my name is Robert Karanja, and I wanted to, I think there's that last bullet on AVAREF, and I'm not very familiar with that program or initiative. If you could share a little bit more about that. And then I also had a comment to make just in terms of, I think as you are closing, Ethel, you were asking what are the barriers or something to that extent. And I think one of the ones that has not really been highlighted a lot is the question of translational research. So I think we have built plenty of capacity for being able to do clinical trials, but there's also a need for biofoundries. How do we take a protein that we've identified or a gene or something that we've identified in the labs, and how do we develop it and under GMP compliant conditions for clinical trials? So that capacity for the engineering biology is one of the key ecosystem infrastructures that we need on the continent. Because to me, my fear is that I see a big disconnect between where the R&D academia actually sits, because in terms of being able to do drug vaccine discovery, a lot of this is now, we are now able to do it. But the ability to then develop it to the point that you can go into clinical trials and optimize the product and meet the required standards is one of the key challenges, and you know, it hit me really in a very big way that there's no region of the world that has that actually has a biofoundry that faced the kind of challenges we faced in terms of access to COVID vaccines. Because whether they got the big ones or not, the ability to develop their own solutions and actually take them to clinical trials and even to their own and even market approval for their nations was possible. For Africa, we are lacking biofoundries, and it's just a huge gap.
Thank you so much for that, Robert. Ethel, do you want to speak to Avaref?
Yes, Avaref. So Avaref is sorry, let me get back. So it's the African Vaccine Regulatory Forum. And this is basically a network of national regulatory authorities that are getting together to create a sort of support system might not be the correct word. So it's using harmonizing their regulatory processes, and also using the principle of relying on each other's expertise and feeding. So it's, if you're part of the network, then you're part of a network that has agreed to share your capacities for regulating, and also to recognize the feedback from the other participating regulatory authorities. And the idea behind this is to sort of ensure that there's collaboration between key stakeholders across the continent. So having aligned requirements for regulation, and aligned also capacities, and also leveraging the capacities of others when you are short of capacity internally. And that is a process, that is a network that is ongoing, even as we look forward to seeing a continental African Medicines Agency, which would potentially be mirroring the other medicines agencies that we know, for example, the European Medicines Agency.
Okay.
Back to you, John.
Thank you, Ethel. And I see one more hand up. If you can unmute.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Yes, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I'm quite learning a lot from it. I just wanted to also add a point to what we are talking about in terms of the barriers to access to vaccines. I just wanted to maybe reiterate or emphasize from my point of view and the research that I'm doing. I'm currently doing a research on the political economy of drug pricing. I'm currently looking at HIV drugs, but however, the elements involved in looking at that concept goes beyond HIV drugs, even into vaccine access. The bottom line, or the most important thing at the end of the day, is probably the pricing of the of the vaccines that we're talking about, which then affects inequality of access. So the richer countries will tend to be able to access these vaccines because they do have generally high income to secure the vaccines. So in my little research that I've done so far, I find something that is overarching in terms of access to drugs, and particularly its impact on prices. which is the patents that comes with manufacturing vaccines. So with this being said, I'll probably want to just suggest to say the intellectual property rights law, which involves the patent law in our diverse jurisdictions, is evolving over time. But overall, it has been seen to be the contributing factor why a lot of biomedical interventions are very expensive. And this really affects countries in Africa which probably do not have a high budget. Total health expenditure for most African countries falls below what is recommended. And this total health expenditure involves part of the money that is directed to research, which includes vaccines, which is very minimal or probably nil at all. However, in contrast to this, if we look at how financing for research has been going on in the pharmaceutical research and development sector, probably in the past 33 decades, there is an evolution and there is evidence that there is increase in public funds, sources of funds. So a lot of governments and a lot of nations are now providing resources to assist so-called private sponsors who are finding it more and more financially difficult to engage in research and development to bring a new vaccine to market approval. So most countries now are collaborating, as most of our colleagues have been suggesting. All the platforms that are being discussed here probably constitute what I'm trying to say, that there are pathways through which governments are mingling and joining hands with the private sector to actually try to quicken the development of vaccines. However, I just want to reiterate that as long as the intellectual property rights law hasn't changed, at the end of the day, the negotiating powers in terms of the pricing of the drugs, which will eventually affect how much is secured and at what rate, will definitely affect even with these platforms in place. So I just wanted to more or less just to reiterate that from my view, I really feel that probably the intellectual property rights in terms of drugs should probably be looked into more, because it really does have a lot to do. There are other aspects that will affect the price of a drug, which is the general market issues like demand and supply, and also the manner in which the drug is going to be paid for, the type of the health system. All these things, they will affect the price of the vaccine. But I think the overarching one should be the patent law in Africa. I know that the African Union has developed a model for a model that looks into development of drugs in Africa. I do not know how far that is now, but maybe one of us is more aware of the developments there, which is one of the things that I appreciate, that at least if there is steps that are taken along that direction, definitely it will be sustainable for us to develop drugs from scratch, having the right amount of ownership and the right amount of negotiating power in terms of pricing of the vaccines. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. All those points, including the intellectual property rights, right? It's so interesting that you mentioned that AVAC is sponsoring a webinar. Like at the top of the hour, actually, on IP and tech transfers. And I will, that session will be recorded, so I will make sure to send that recording along, where they'll be talking about why those IP and tech transfers are important in equity, vaccine manufacturing, but as it relates to pandemic preparedness. So look out for that. And there were some other questions in the chat. Gladys agreed with Robert. This is a big black hole between translational research at research institutions and the development of vaccine candidates with sufficient proof of concept to advance to clinical trials. Bridging this gap will be important for the sustainability of increased vaccine manufacturing capacity. And then someone else, Funge, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. They mentioned whatever happened to the pooled procurement initiative. It is critical in making a business case for vaccine manufacturing in Africa. And my colleague at AVAC actually responded, I think it just came too late for COVID-19. This is why the negotiations in the pandemic accord are so important. We need to secure those agreements in peacetime, quote unquote, when there isn't a pandemic, because of course countries will be interested in securing for their own populations during an actual emergency. And she added, African countries need to be loud in those rooms. As you mentioned in the Mentimeter that we did earlier, making lots of noise, right? And AVAC does a great job of putting out these opportunities where civil society can join the pandemic board, can make sure that they're in the rooms where decisions are being negotiated and made. So we will make sure to share those opportunities with this group as well, so that you can make noise, you can advocate, and you can ensure that you're part of the conversation. And Jamie, thank you for joining us. She has to hop off, but for future discussion, I would love to hear more about regulatory strengthening that needs to accompany the translational research and manufacturing. Yes, yes,
We
yes.
will liaise with this.
Say that one more time. Oh, maybe you weren't speaking to me. But yes, Jamie, thank you so much for bringing that that aspect into it, the regulatory strengthening the regulatory capacity. Great, thank you so much. That was a great discussion. I do want to talk a little bit more about what are other barriers that you all are, we talked about the disconnect between translational research or research centers to the manufacturing component. We talked about regulatory strengthening, as Jamie brought up. We talked about IPR. What are some other barriers that you see to increasing vaccine manufacturing in Africa?
I'm not sure if I would be restating what somebody had already brought up, but maybe the procurement aspect. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if you mentioned that. And actually, Fungai had put that in the chat and asking about the pooled procurement initiative and making a business case for local manufacturing. Mm-hmm. So I think that actually is a fourth point.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. What other barriers exist? And then we'll talk about a little bit about our advocacy asks, right? Philister mentions myths and misconceptions about vaccines as suspicion about vaccines, right? Yes, vaccine hesitancy, right? We have to make sure that when the vaccines are manufactured, the research is done, we have procured it, but we've overcome all those hurdles, but then what if no one wants the vaccine because they don't trust the vaccine, right? So that has to go hand in hand with increasing manufacturing capacity, is really kind of like increasing education around vaccines and misconceptions of vaccines and the vaccine process. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Fungi mentions investment finance. I'm wondering if you wanted to say a little bit more about that. Investment finance. If not, that's okay. Safety concerns, Felista. Thank you for bringing that up. Liema says, in most conversations related to local production manufacturing, there's always a question on quality. Why do we always associate inadequate quality to Africa? That's a great point, Liema. That's a great point. Subpar research, like the research isn't as rigorous as those done in the global north, right? That is a great point. Thank you. And that needs to be part of the conversation.
And is that actually a reality? And I think maybe we should have a bit of a conversation about that. Is that a reality? Is our research really subpar?
Yeah, feel free to unmute.
Hello. Sorry. For me, I'm in the research environment, actually. I'm a medical doctor. I'm currently doing clinical research trials in a site in South Africa. So one of my experiences is that when we were conducting research on COVID-19 vaccines, I realized that because it was a multinational trial, so we get adverse events reports from all the sites that are in the study as principal investigators. So one of the things that I sort of passively picked was that the reporting of adverse events from high-income countries was kind of more than in the severity of the reports were more than what we were getting this site. For instance, our participants would rarely report an adverse event that has to do with, say, brain blood clots. I think you all know that one of the vaccines was associated with blood clots during the COVID pandemic research. So most of those reports were coming from high-income countries, but those studies we're also doing them this side in Africa. This speaks to quality and reporting. So there are really many factors that really, I like what my sister just more like a question to say, is that really the case or not? Like to say, there are a lot of factors that lead to differences in reporting of adverse events, regardless whether we're studying a vaccine or we're studying another drug, say a cancer drug, or we're studying an HIV drug or a hypertension drug. People's tendency to report an adverse event differs. FDA monitors the quality of research that is done globally for most of the trials that are ongoing, and the quality of those trials is important because it has to do with safeguarding human involvement in research and making sure that sites adhere to internationally approved standards of conducting research, and also to assure the quality of scientific data that comes from research, if it is dependable and reliable and usable for a scientific decision, either to approve or not to approve a drug. So if the quality of research is poor, then it raises questions to say, is this data okay for us to use to make scientific conclusions or not. And it's very worrying if we are coming to a conclusion that research that is done in Africa is of poor quality, and we do not want to engage, to want to understand what is the meaning of this observation in detail. I would want to entertain that it might not be like so per se. Why am I saying this? Because quality in health is different from quality in other spheres of industry. By virtue of how health is in nature, its nature, health production differs from most of the other type of production we can talk about. Maybe we can talk about transport industry. It's very easy for us to measure in progression in our transport industry, the quality of the roads, the type of accidents that happen, how we renew our driving license and everything. But when we come to measure health and this quality and this improvement, it's quite difficult, because it's difficult to measure health improvement. It's the same thing with health production in the research and development space. It's not easy to come to a conclusion what is progress in health production in terms of research and development of drugs. Why? Because the concept of health and its nature is difficult. I've already given an example to say high-income countries would report more severe adverse events more than low-income countries. At least from my experience, this is what I experienced, but it could be different from someone who was in the same. For what I know is that there were few reports of adverse events of that nature, grade 3, grade 4, from low-income countries. Why is it like that? So from the theories of health production, from a health economic perspective, you realize that health responds to income a lot in a number of ways. For instance, it has been seen that for every unit of quality improved, the amount of money that has to be poured in to produce that unit of quality is very exponentially high compared to the quantity. So we know that most of our low middle income countries have got less income. I would want to argue, because already one of us has questioned whether is this really the case or not. But I would want to argue and say and suggest that the reporting of quality aspects is vulnerable to aspects that are not really reflective of the actual events that are happening, because of what I'm trying to explain, to say the nature of how health differs from other industries in terms of measuring quality. It will be easier to or maybe quality aspects okay, just want to round up. Quality aspects can easily be reported in an environment that is different from another environment. I don't know whether I'm trying to make it clear. Like, different environments will report different quality aspects, not because the fundamental processes are different, but because there are other aspects beyond maybe the metrics that are used, that are influenced by those who are interpreting and those that are reporting the quality aspects. Then that brings up the differences. But I'm sure that we did have central nervous system adverse events during COVID-19 trials, but maybe they were not reported. The reason why they were not reported could be due to other aspects, maybe of the health system or the literacy of our participants, and there could be other aspects that were affecting the quality reporting aspects. That's what I'm trying to explain.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for your perspective as a researcher in this space. And thank you for the dialogue in the chat as well. I think there needs to be, as Ethel and others, Sultan and Liema, who brought up the topic, is really addressing this connotation, right? The negative connotation that research coming from Africa is subpar. It's not up to the standard of, and who creates that standard, right? We talked earlier about decolonization, right? That is part of the, as one of our speakers on many of our decolonization topics, Dr. Agnes Beniguahu has mentioned, is the fact that this connotation even exists has roots in colonization, that Africans and anti-Blackness is a thing, right? So that needs to be addressed. And are there opportunities to advocate, to partner with researchers? What are some of the things that we can do to address the misconception that local research is synonymous with substandard quality, right? What can we do? That is definitely a barrier and part of the advocacy that needs to happen. And this is the avenue. This learning collaborative is really the place to really kind of like discuss and kind of like come together to come up with some of these strategies. Angelo, I see your hand.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, John. And I'm actually not giving a solution, but just highlighting something that I had on a call last week. Our colleagues in India noted something that came with COVID, and as we all know, India manufactures a lot of products that are consumed on the African continent, including medicines and vaccines and other things. But there was a comment on a call last week that when COVID came, like Indians generally are very, very nationalistic. They are proud of, Indian manufacturing and so on and so forth. And yet, when COVID came, there's been lots of questions around the local Indian product and whether it is at par with, other products. So I just wanted to throw that in there. I do agree with you, John, that it has something to do with colonization and that mentality, but I wanted to just throw that in there as well as part of the conversation. So such a huge global manufacturer to have a local population that's traditionally very nationalistic to then start questioning local products. They don't want to consume Indian produced vaccines. It was a very revealing thing to hear from an Indian colleague based in Delhi. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Angela. Any other comments or around this topic, which is a very important one? I know, Ethel, you posed some questions in the chat. Are there any other questions or comments around this concept?
Maybe what I can just add on is that also in Africa, the amount of research that is done in Africa is quite small compared to the global amount of research that is done, like in America, which is the leading region that does most of the research, probably to the range of 40%, like across therapeutic categories, and also Europe, followed by Japan and Asia and Australia, and then Latin America. In Africa, we produce very little research, but it then becomes worrisome to find that with the little research that is done, it is contributing the highest amount of poor quality research. So it's a bit paradoxic observation, because we would want to think that where there is probably minimal research that is done, because most of the research anyway is funded and sponsored from outside sources. So we would think that probably there should be more opportunity to improve quality and to improve better research. But I think it's a conflicting observation for me also to note that, considering the differences in the amount of research that is done across regions.
And I just wanted to add something to what you said, is not a lot of the research is initiated in Africa. Is usually initiated in the Americas, Europe, whatnot. But we need to address the fact that African and Black bodies are often used in that research, right? So without initiating it, African bodies are used for that research. So they're contributing to the research, right? So it's just kind of like talking about the colonization and the kind of mindset, right? Of who is developing the research agenda, right? Who initiates the research? Are there civil society involvement in developing the research plan, right? And it's like the research is initiated in the global North using African and Black bodies, even in the United States, but then the product gets released in the global North and shut out the global South, right? That's usually the cycle, right? You use African bodies to prove that it's efficacious, but then you deny access to the product once it's approved, right? So that's kind of like why we're here, right? Is to come up with strategies and advocacy priorities and solutions to really kind of figure out what is the next step. So what do we need to do? Ethel, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just following up on your point and bringing up a contradiction of sorts. So from one perspective, there's the aspect of globally not initiated research that then the final the trials for efficacy are conducted on continent, and then on the other aspect, there's the and I stand to be corrected. There's the perspective of suspicion towards first in human trials, or first phase 1 clinical trials being done in Africa, and we ask, where else has it been done? So from the perspectives of perhaps from our regulatory perspective, wanting to know where else has it been done. So then doesn't that cancel out the opportunity to have research initiated right from the early stages of development in continent?
Okay, so thank you so much. I would love to respond to this because we are raising such a critical observation also, that there could be cancelling or neutralizing opportunities. But for me, what also that I've found through the legal insight that I've tried to look into the political economy of drug pricing, we see that it's not only the patent for the active ingredient or the active candidate drug or vaccine that is patented. It is the innovations in the value chain. For instance, for high throughput screening technologies, which are technologies that will actually identify out of, say, 10,000 molecules that can trigger a cellular receptor for an ideal response that can be used for developing a new vaccine, for instance. There are also patents for all those value chain technologies or innovations. So it's not only the candidate drug that is patented. a lot is patented in the preclinical discovery that probably we overlook and constitutes the barrier to access. So we could say in Africa have a candidate vaccine that we probably have reasonable scientific ground that it will be able to have a desired effect or able to prime the immune system for a given disease and protect our populations. However, in the process of actually conducting the preclinical studies from drug discovery right up to first in human, it involves a lot of biotechnical technologies that are employed there, and all those things are patented. It's not like they're freely available to use. So I think the barrier that is related to intellectual property law is huge than we think. It's not just the drug, but all the technologies that are involved. We need to have the right to access to use them, or the right to actually manufacture them. The laboratory diagnostics, all those things are patented. For us to test a cellular marker, we need reagents to see if this vaccine that we've discovered in Africa, does it work or not? So we need all those laboratory reagents. There are quite many. They are so numerous, I can't even count them, and a lot. So the problem is really huge. The barrier is really huge when it comes to which emanates from how the intellectual property law is structured. It is structured in such a way that the moment you want to do your own stuff, you'll find that the mountain that you need to climb in order to start doing your own stuff might put you in a default position to say it's not worth it. Let me just buy this thing from outside. It's a kind of situation. So, however, I think if we do, like I've said before, if we do work on and argue and negotiate locally and in the
I think you muted yourself.
well, I think I'd muted myself.
Yeah.
So you did not hear anything at all.
Yeah, no,
Okay,
we heard the, yes, we did. We just heard we just missed the last minute of what you said.
Okay, so I think that's that. It's the huge barrier really is the small intellectual property rights and patents that are put in the whole value chain. So it's not just drugs. So we need to climb that mountain to come to a point where we say we can manufacture something without having to ask for a lot of permissions to have this machine, to have this chemical, to have this method. Sometimes even scientific processing methods are patented. You can't just employ them without getting permission from the person who started them some way. So like, it's a very huge thing that we need to do. So I think it's all centered on the intellectual property rights law, locally and internationally. That's what probably we may need to really look into, so that at least we've got a lot of biochemical engineers, genetic engineers, we do have them. We do have resources and latent income or latent resources to actually buy to buy other resources that we might not have that are beneficial in the value chain of developing drugs. But without us having that, it really looks like it's gonna take a while for us to, you know, not being pessimistic, but just being realistic with what is there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And one last question. I do want to address the question that Ethel put in the chat, because as you know, this group also kind of like puts on the Africa Health R&D Week, which last year was our inaugural. This year will be our second annual. And we really want to, this is a robust conversation, and we really want to kind of figure out who is missing from this conversation, right? Who do we need to, who needs to be hearing all of those concerns that we're bringing up right now about how we're can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
It's
Okay.
the full screen though.
Say it again?
It's the full screen. You can see all the slides, but we can see it.
Oh, yes.
But can you see the one question? Whom do we think is missing out of this conversation?
Yes.
Yes, regarding any of the issues raised.
Yes. So
Yeah.
please use the link that I just put in the chat. And so we could capture like who is missing from this conversation. Who do we want to hear from when it comes to connecting R&D to manufacturing, when it comes to IPR issues, when it comes to regulatory issues, the business case for local manufacturing, Africa-led R&D. Who is missing from this conversation? Who are the key stakeholders that need to hear these concerns and have the power to change and make the decisions, right? We'd love to hear from you so that we can invite them to future meetings, right? Invite them to the Africa Health R&D Week, where we can really kind of like dissect the issues at a more granular level. We know we only had 90 minutes today, but who is missing from this conversation? Someone to speak to the aspect of AFCTA, if someone can educate me on what that stands for, that would be great. Or put it in the chat what that stands for, because I'm not familiar.
That's Africa Continental Free Trade.
Perfect. Lovely. Thank you. The World Health Organization, Africa CDC, government reps, policymakers, the manufacturers themselves, right? The end user, right? The person who, the people, the community members that will ultimately be utilizing these products, right? To combat the vaccine hesitancy, to combat this notion that that African research is subpar, right? We need to combat that with education, with community outreach. Researchers, the private sector, the media, right? Researchers in R&D funding space with evidence to support advocacy and highlight funding gaps, opportunities, priorities. So GFinder, the patenters themselves, R&D funders. And thank you for this, because we have people on the call that have access and have contacts with these individuals. So we can work on really kind of like figuring out who to invite to these meetings, private sector, legal experts, especially on IPR. As I mentioned, AVAC is sponsoring another webinar that's happening right now that is talking about IP tech transfers as it relates to pandemic preparedness, which has applications, obviously, and implications for vaccine manufacturing. That I will share.
Could we ask you to share your screen of the cloud, the word cloud that is forming? We actually can't see it.
Oh, you can't see it? Oh, that's...
We're still on the question.
Okay, let me just unshare and reshare.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Oh, that's the wrong one. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. And all my millions of tabs. Great. As I mentioned, there's a webinar that's happening right now. I will be sure to send the recording to that. That's talking specifically about IP issues and how to kind of like overcome those. Africa Intellectual Property Rights Organization, medical research councils, definitely. And if you have contacts and access to individuals at any of these sectors, researchers, funders, private sector, World Health Organization, legal experts on IPR, please do reach out, right? Because we would love to have you connect them to this group so that we can really have a robust conversation and come up with solutions. We don't want to be doom, negative, or naysayers, right? We don't want to just talk about the issues and the barriers. We want to talk solutions as well, and what we can do to really advocate and come up with solutions. All righty. So we are getting to the end of, we have 1 more minute. I don't know if anyone else wants to say anything. Ethel, Angelo, William, if you want to say anything as we close today.
No, just to thank all of us for such an engaging and I believe productive conversation. It's really great to hear the various perspectives. We've got very many insights, and we've also gotten ideas. You know, you've shared your proposals or your ideas of what we can or should be doing going forward with regards to advocacy, if we are really to see if we're really to see local vaccine manufacture as a reality.
Great, thanks, Ethel. And mine is also to just thank everyone for showing up today. This space is for you, and you have showed us today how rich a conversation this is, and we are always excited to have these conversations. And you just when you show up like this and have the depth of a conversation, it really warms all of us, and we can't wait for the next conversation. So thank you all.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And Maureen puts a last important point in the chat. These conversations are happening separately. This is the purpose of the Learning Collaborative, to bring advocates and researchers together so that we could discuss the issues, and then we could bring in government officials. We could bring in the World Health Organization. We could bring in Africa CDC, so that once we deliver this message to them, we're on one accord, right? We're on the same page. So we thank you so much for contributing to this conversation. This is not the last conversation we'll be having. And we'll be developing a listserv for this group so that we can share information, share things that come up, and feel free to also share stuff that you come across that are relevant to anything domestic resource mobilization related. So thank you so much for joining, and have a great day. And have a great Easter holiday and Passover.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks and bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Traditional systems, that one will be recorded as well. Thanks, Moyo.
I'm
Thank
saving
you.
the chat as well.
Yeah.
Perfect. Have a great day.
Bye.